Over the top, lads! Move, move! Go, go, go! Forward!
July 1st, 1916, 7:30 a.m. Along the Western Front, thousands of whistles blow in unison. By 7:50 a.m., entire battalions have effectively ceased to exist. In the sector assigned to the Newfoundland Regiment, the devastation is absolute. The rate of attrition defies comprehension. For every second that passed, a soldier fell. When the sun rose the next morning and the roll was called, only 68 men responded. A fighting unit of hundreds was almost completely wiped out within 30 minutes. This was not merely a defeat. It was a demographic catastrophe compressed into the time it takes to eat breakfast. How does a modern military force evaporate so quickly? Now, let's open the archives and zero in on the story. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must look past the mud and the poetry usually associated with World War I and look strictly at the data. The first day of the Somme remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, with 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 dead. But the true horror lies in the temporal density of the killing. This was not a slow grind. It was an industrial pulse of destruction. When we visualize the battlefield timeline, we see a distinct disconnect between the strategic plan and the tactical reality. The plan relied on the shatter effect, the assumption that a week-long artillery bombardment had pulverized the German defenses, cut the barbed wire, and buried the defenders. Consequently, the infantry was ordered to advance at a walking pace, in neat lines, to occupy what headquarters believed was empty ground. They were walking into a mathematical impossibility. The German defenses were deep, their dugouts were intact, and their machine guns were pre-sighted on the very gaps in the wire where the British troops were funneled. As the British artillery lifted, shifting its fire to the rear to block a German retreat that would never happen, the German gunners simply climbed up from their bunkers and manned their weapons. The result was a convergence of outdated tactics and modern kinetic power. But nowhere was this convergence more lethal than at Beaumont-Hamel, where the Newfoundland Regiment prepared to go over the top, unaware that they were stepping into a kill zone that had already claimed the waves of men before them. To grasp the specific texture of this tragedy, we must focus our lens on the Newfoundland Regiment. In 1916, Newfoundland was not yet part of Canada. It was a separate dominion of the British Empire, a rugged island community with a population of less than 250,000. The men who stood in the reserve trenches at Beaumont-Hamel were not conscripts. They were the Blue Putties, the first 500 volunteers who had signed up with a distinct national pride. They were neighbors, fishermen, and brothers, bound together by a tight-knit geography that would make their collective destruction all the more devastating for the families back home. By 8:45 a.m., the initial British attack at Beaumont-Hamel had already failed catastrophically. The leading waves, the South Wales Borderers and the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, had been cut down before they even reached the German wire. The communication trenches leading to the front line were choked with the dead and the dying, creating a logistical deadlock. No information was coming back, and no reinforcements could move forward. Yet, amidst this chaos, the divisional commander, misinterpreting a flare signal as success on the right flank, ordered the Newfoundland Regiment to advance immediately. This order contained a fatal tactical complication. Because the communication trenches were blocked with casualties from the first wave, the Newfoundlanders could not reach the forward jumping-off line underground. Instead, they were forced to climb out of the reserve trenches christened Street John's Road and walk across 250 yards of open ground just to reach their own front line. They were exposed to enemy fire before the attack had even officially begun. The German defenders on the ridge opposite watched this unfold with disbelief. They did not have to scan the horizon. The targets were silhouetted against the skyline, moving over open ground in formation. The regiment advanced into a funnel. The geography of the battlefield at Beaumont-Hamel dips into a valley, channeling any attacking force toward a single, natural choke point. At the center of this kill zone stood a solitary, withered landmark, the danger tree. This petrified skeleton of a tree stripped of its branches by previous shell fire, marked the halfway point between the British and German lines. It was the only vertical feature in a landscape of pulverized chalk. For the advancing troops, it was a psychological magneto rally point to aim for in the chaos. For the German machine gun crews, it was a pre-registered reference point. They had calculated the range to the danger tree down to the meter. They didn't need to aim. They simply clamped their MG8 Spandaus into position and flooded the area with lead. As the Newfoundlanders crested the rise, they walked into a wall of traversing fire. There was no running, no taking cover. The density of the incoming rounds meant that luck was no longer a variable. Men were hit 3, 4, 5 times before they hit the ground. The advance did not falter due to a lack of courage. It was physically erased by the kinetic energy of the German defense. Witnesses described the regiment leaning forward as if walking into a blizzard. Within 15 to 20 minutes, the offensive capability of the unit was annihilated. The few who reached the danger tree were instantly targeted. Observers noted that the dead were not scattered randomly. They lay in heaps, marking the precise lines where the German machine guns had traversed. The field was carpeted in khaki, motionless. The commander of the 29th Division, looking through his binoculars, later remarked that it was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault only failed of success because dead men can advance no further. But valor does not deflect ballistics. By 9:45 a.m., the battle for the Newfoundland Regiment was over. The survivors, those who could crawl, began the agonizing inch-by-inch retreat back to their own lines, leaving behind a generation of the island's youth entangled in the uncut wire. The annihilation of the Newfoundland Regiment was not a result of a lack of spirit, nor was it simply the result of bad luck. It was the inevitable output of a systemic failure in British engineering and tactical planning. To understand why 68 men answered the roll call instead of 800, we must look away from the soldiers and zero in on the munitions they trusted to pave their way. The catastrophe at Beaumont-Hamel was written in the factories of England months before a single shot was fired. The core of the failure lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of ballistics against static defenses. The British bombardment plan relied on volume rather than precision. Over 1.5 million shells were fired in the week leading up to the attack. On paper, this density of fire should have turned the German trenches into dust. However, the breakdown of the ammunition types reveals the fatal flaw. Approximately 2/3 of the shells fired were shrapnel shells, not high-explosive A-she. We must visualize the mechanics of a 1,916 shrapnel shell to understand its inefficiency here. Designed for colonial warfare against troops moving in the open, a shrapnel shell functions like a flying shotgun. It contains a charge of gunpowder behind a payload of lead balls. A time fuse triggers the charge in the air, ejecting the balls forward in a cone of death. Against a line of infantry in the open, it is devastating. Against the intricate, dense thickets of German barbed wire, it is nearly useless. The wire at Beaumont-Hamel was not a simple fence. It was a three-dimensional matrix of hardened steel loops, often 5 feet high and 30 feet deep, secured by iron stakes. When shrapnel balls hit this wire, they largely passed through the gaps, or lacked the kinetic energy to shear the steel strands. The wire remained intact. The British infantry were told the wire would be cut. In reality, the bombardment had merely tangled it further, creating an even more impenetrable barrier. Compounding this doctrinal error was a crisis of industrial quality control. The rapid expansion of the British munitions industry meant that millions of shells were being produced in converted factories by inexperienced labor. The result was a staggering dud rate. Post-battle analysis suggests that nearly 30% of the shells fired at the Somme failed to detonate. This was due to the faulty No, 80, and No 100 fuses, which were often machined with poor tolerances or filled with low-grade explosives. The German defenders later reported watching thousands of shells thud harmlessly into the mud. The drum fire that was supposed to break their morale was, in many sectors, a phantom barrage. But the failure above ground was matched by the tactical reality below ground. The geography of the Somme consists of deep, soft chalk. This allowed the German engineers to dig deep, far deeper than the Allied planners anticipated. We need to visualize the German defensive architecture, the Stollen. These were not mere trenches. They were subterranean complexes dug 30 to 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete and timber, often capable of housing an entire company. They had electricity, ventilation, and water pumps. The standard British field guns, the 18-pounders, lacked the plunging fire capability to penetrate this depth. Even the heavier howitzers, firing high explosive, often failed to crack these deep chalk bunkers. While the British artillery pounded the surface, the German garrison sat safely in the Stollen, waiting out the storm. They played cards, cleaned their rifles, and waited for the silence. They knew that the moment the shelling stopped, the infantry attack would follow. This created a deadly dynamic known as the race to the parapet. The moment the British barrage lifted, moving to the rear lines in a creeping pattern, the German defenders had to climb up steep wooden staircases from their dugouts, haul their machine guns into position, and feed the ammunition belts. The British infantry had to cross no man's land before the Germans could win this race. At Beaumont-Hamel, a specific tactical decision ensured the Germans would win the race by a landslide. 10 minutes before 0 hour at 7:20 a.m. the British detonated a massive mine beneath the German strongpoint at Hawthorne Ridge. 40,000 pounds of ammonal tore, a crater 40 feet deep and 100 feet wide. It was a spectacular display of power, intended to destroy a key redoubt. However, the timing was disastrous. The attack was not scheduled until 7:30 a.m. The mine explosion acted as a colossal alarm clock. It alerted every German defender in the sector that the attack was imminent. But because the British artillery paused to let the debris settle, the Germans had 10 full minutes to scramble up from their dugouts, set up their MG-8 machine guns on the crater lip, and sight their weapons on the very gaps the British were expected to attack. The MG-8 is a water-cooled, belt-fed weapon capable of firing 500 rounds per minute. It does not overheat easily. It is designed for grazing fire, locking the barrel at knee height and sweeping back and forth. When the Newfoundland Regiment climbed out of their trenches, they were not facing a suppressed enemy. They were walking into the sights of heavy weapons.
lads,
Crews who had been alerted were fully prepared and were operating in a target-rich environment with zero suppression from the British artillery. The tragedy was mathematical. The speed of the German reaction time was faster than the speed of the British traverse across the mud. The wire was uncut because the physics of shrapnel shells made it impossible to cut. The German gunners were alive because the geology of the chalk protected them. The danger tree became a focal point for slaughter, not because of bad luck, but because the suppression plan had failed in every conceivable mechanical metric. The aftermath of July 1st was not just a military defeat. For Newfoundland, it was a national amputation. The tactical failure at Beaumont-Hamel, driven by the mechanical failures of the artillery and the strategic blindness of the command, rippled outward from France to the small communities of the North Atlantic. When the telegrams began to arrive in Street John's, the silence was deafening. Almost every street, every fishing village, and every family lost someone. The unit had suffered a casualty rate of over 90% among those who went over the top. The 68 men who answered the roll call the next morning represented the shattered remnants of a generation. The officers were gone. The NCOs were gone. The blue putties, the best and brightest of the Dominion, had been spent in less time than it takes to play a single half of football. This catastrophe had consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The loss of so many young men crippled the Dominion's economy and its future leadership class. The psychological blow was so severe, and the financial burden of the war so heavy, that it arguably set the stage for Newfoundland to surrender its independence and join the Canadian Confederation decades later. The danger tree didn't just mark the limit of an advance, It marked the end of Newfoundland as a self-reliant nation. The Battle of the Somme continued for months, grinding on to claim over 1 million casualties on all sides. But Beaumont-Hamel remains a unique case study in the collision between human courage and industrial reality. It demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that in the 20th century, valor is irrelevant if the ballistics fail. The uncut wire and the intact machine guns proved that war had ceased to be a contest of will. It had become a contest of engineering. The Newfoundlanders did exactly what was asked of them. They followed orders with impeccable discipline. They walked into the fire not because they were foolish, but because they trusted a system that had already failed them before they even left the trench. Today, the battlefield at Beaumont-Hamel is one of the few on the Western Front where the trenches remain preserved. You can still see the narrow gap of no man's land. You can see the petri dish of the kill zone. And standing there, you realize the terrifying proximity of it all. The distance from the British front line to the German wire is shockingly short a distance a person could sprint in 30 seconds. Yet, for the Newfoundland Regiment, it was an infinite distance, an unbridgeable gap created by the failure of shrapnel shells and the precision of the MG8. The danger tree still stands today, a skeletal replica marking the original spot. It serves as a stark, silent witness to the arithmetic of slaughter. It reminds us that when we zero in on history, we don't just find maps and movements. We find the precise moment where technology outpaced tactics, and we see the human price paid for that delay. The silence at Beaumont-Hamel is not peace. It is the echo of a generation lost before breakfast.